Right now, the world around you is louder than it has ever been. Your phone vibrates with notifications, news headlines race across screens, opinions flood social media, and everywhere you look someone is telling you what to fear, what to believe, and what to worry about next. Can feel overwhelming, can feel like the noise never stops. Somewhere inside all that chaos, many believers quietly start to wonder something they rarely say out loud. God, are you still speaking? But here's the powerful reminder many people need today. God has never stopped speaking, not for a single moment. The problem is not God's silence. The problem is the noise. Think about it for a moment. Throughout history, God rarely spoke in the ways people expected. He didn't always appear with thunder and earthquakes. In fact, some of the most powerful moments in faith happened when God spoke in ways that were quiet, gentle, and easy to miss if someone wasn't paying attention. While the world runs on speed and distraction, God often moves in stillness. And today, stillness has become rare. Wake up and immediately check our phones. We scroll before we even think. We rush through our days carrying stress, deadlines, responsibilities, worries about the future. Our minds are constantly occupied. And when life feels heavy, we sometimes assume that if God were speaking, it would be obvious, dramatic, impossible to ignore. But that's not always how He works. Sometimes God speaks through a quiet conviction in your heart that tells you not to give up. Sometimes He speaks through a moment of unexpected peace when everything around you feels uncertain. Sometimes He speaks through a verse, a message, or a conversation that reaches you at exactly the moment you needed it most. Those moments are not accidents. They are reminders. Reminders that even when the world feels chaotic, even when life feels confusing, even when prayers seem unanswered, God is still present and still working in ways we cannot always see right away. The real question every believer must ask themselves today is not whether God is speaking. The real question is whether we are willing to slow down long enough to hear Him. Because when we finally quiet the noise, pause the distractions, and turn our attention back toward Him, something powerful begins to happen. We start to notice the guidance we were missing, begin to feel the peace we thought was gone. We recognize that God has been closer than we realized the entire time. And sometimes the most life-changing thing a believer can do is simply stop, listen, and remember that God has been speaking all along. Have you ever prayed for something with your whole heart, and then waited, and nothing seemed to happen? You believed. You asked God sincerely. You hoped that maybe this time the answer would come quickly. But days passed, weeks passed, maybe even months or years, and slowly, quietly, a dangerous thought begins to whisper in the back of your mind. Maybe God forgot about me. Many believers reach this moment in their faith journey. It's the moment where silence feels confusing, where waiting feels heavy, and where patience begins to feel like disappointment. We live in a world that moves fast. We want something, we expect results immediately. Messages arrive instantly. Packages arrive in days. Information arrives in seconds. So when we pray and the answer doesn't come quickly, it can feel like something is wrong. But the truth is something every believer must remember today. A delay is not the same as a denial. Just because God has not answered yet does not mean He has said no. Some of the greatest stories of faith were built in seasons of waiting. Seasons where nothing looked like it was changing. Seasons where people wondered if their prayers were even being heard. But behind the scenes, God was already working in ways they could not yet see. Waiting is one of the hardest tests of faith because it forces us to trust God when we cannot see the full picture. It forces us to believe that something is happening even when life feels still. Sometimes the blessing you are asking for is real, but the timing is not ready. Sometimes God delays because the situation around you needs to change first. Sometimes the people involved need to change, and sometimes, the most difficult truth to accept, we need to change. Because the blessing you're praying for might require a stronger version of you, a wiser version of you, a more prepared version of you. Imagine receiving everything you prayed for before you were ready to carry it. The pressure could break you. The responsibility could overwhelm you. What feels like a delay might actually be protection. God sees the full road ahead while we can only see the next few steps. So while you are waiting, God may be building something inside you. patience, strength, faith that is deeper than circumstances. The kind of faith that does not collapse the moment life becomes uncertain. And one day, many believers look back at their waiting season and realize something surprising. The moment they thought God was distant was actually the moment He was preparing the greatest part of their story. So if you are in a season where prayers feel unanswered, where progress feels slow, where hope feels fragile, remember this simple but powerful truth. God's silence is never God's absence, because sometimes the longest waits lead to the most powerful miracles. And that leads to a question every believer must face in the quiet moments of their life. What if the storm you're trying to escape is actually the place where your faith is about to become stronger than ever before? If the storm you're trying so hard to escape is actually the place where your faith is meant to grow stronger than ever before. It's a difficult thought, isn't it? Because no one asks for storms. No one wakes up hoping for hardship, pain, uncertainty, or sleepless nights filled with questions. We all want peace. We want stability. We want life to feel secure and predictable. And when things are going well, when the bills are paid, when relationships are healthy, when our plans are working out, it feels natural to say we trust God. But the real test of faith rarely happens when everything is going right. It feels easy when the sky is clear. It feels natural when life makes sense. But when the clouds roll in, when plans fall apart, prayers seem unanswered, and the future feels uncertain, that's when belief begins to feel like a challenge instead of a comfort. And yet, those are often the very moments when faith becomes the most powerful. Because faith was never meant to exist only in perfect conditions. Faith was designed to stand when circumstances begin to shake. Anyone can believe when there is evidence in front of them, believing when you can't see the outcome, believing when the situation looks impossible, believing when fear tries to take control. That kind of faith transforms a person. Storms have a way of revealing what we truly trust. When life becomes difficult, we begin asking deeper questions. We search for meaning. We lean into prayer in ways we didn't before. The things that once distracted us start to lose their power. And suddenly what matters most becomes clearer than ever. It's in the middle of those storms that many believers discover something surprising. God was never asking for perfect strength. He was asking for trust. Not the kind of trust that exists only when everything makes sense, but the kind that says, even though I don't understand this moment, I still believe God is guiding my path. A storm's refine faith in a way comfort never can. Think about it. Some of the strongest believers you've ever met probably didn't grow their faith during easy seasons. Their faith grew through loss, through uncertainty, through moments when giving up would have been the easiest choice. Yet somehow they held on. And through that struggle, their belief became deeper, steadier, and stronger than before. God never promised a life without storms. But again and again, believers are reminded of something far more powerful. You were never meant to face those storms alone. Even when the waves feel high. Even when the wind feels strong. Even when fear whispers that you might not make it through. God is still present in the storm. And sometimes the storm itself becomes the place where believers finally discover just how strong their faith can truly become. Here's something many people don't realize. Sometimes the breakthrough you're waiting for doesn't begin with a dramatic miracle. Sometimes it begins with one small act of obedience. Sometimes the breakthrough you're waiting for doesn't begin with a dramatic miracle. Sometimes it begins with one small act of obedience. That idea can feel surprising because many people imagine that when God moves, it will always be something huge, something obvious, something impossible to miss. We imagine massive moments, seas parting, mountains moving, sudden life-changing events that transform everything overnight. But often, the beginning of a miracle looks far less dramatic than we expect. It looks like a small step, a quiet decision, a simple moment where a believer chooses to trust God even when the instruction feels small, confusing, or even uncomfortable. Many people wait for God to do something big in their lives, but they overlook the small things He may already be asking them to do. They pray for direction, yet hesitate when the first step appears. They hope for change but resist the tiny acts of faith that lead toward it. But throughout countless moments of faith, something becomes clear. Big transformations often start with very small obedience. Sometimes it's forgiving someone when holding on to anger feels easier. Sometimes it's choosing honesty when cutting corners would benefit you. Sometimes it's helping someone quietly without expecting recognition. Sometimes it's stepping toward a calling that feels uncertain or intimidating. These moments may seem small in the moment, almost insignificant compared to the big miracle we are hoping for. But small obedience creates movement, and movement invites God to work in ways we cannot always predict. Think about how many life-changing stories begin with a single decision. A person choosing to trust God despite fear. A believer saying yes, even though they cannot see the full plan ahead. A quiet act of faith that no one else notices but heaven does. Those moments matter more than we realize. Because obedience is not about understanding every detail of the journey. It's about trusting the one who sees the entire path. Believers wait for absolute certainty before taking a step. They often remain stuck in the same place. But when someone chooses to obey, even with questions still in their heart, something begins to shift. Faith becomes active instead of passive. Trust becomes visible instead of theoretical. And sometimes that single step unlocks a chain of events far greater than anyone expected. The door that seemed closed suddenly opens. The opportunity that seemed impossible begins to appear. The guidance that once felt distant becomes clearer. Not because the step was big, because obedience created space for God to move. Many believers spend years praying for miracles while overlooking the small invitations God places in front of them each day. Yet the truth remains, the size of the step doesn't determine the power of the outcome. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin with the simplest choices. A moment of trust, quiet yes, a step taken in faith before the full picture becomes clear. And here's the part that can change everything for someone listening today. Even when no one else notices those small moments of faith, there is someone who always does. Even when no one else notices those small moments of faith, there is someone who always does. There are days when it feels like the effort you're putting into your faith goes completely unseen. You try to stay strong. You keep praying even when life feels heavy. You keep choosing patience when frustration would be easier. You try to live with integrity in a world that often rewards the opposite. And sometimes, if you're honest, it can start to feel like none of it matters. People don't see the battles happening inside your mind. They don't hear the quiet prayers you whisper late at night. They don't notice the moments when you almost gave up but somehow chose to keep trusting God anyway. Those struggles often happen in silence. And in those silent moments, a person can begin to feel invisible. You may look around and see others receiving recognition, success, or attention while your own journey feels hidden and unnoticed. You might wonder if your efforts to stay faithful are making any real difference. You might question whether the quiet sacrifices you're making even matter. Here is a reminder every believer needs to hear today: nothing in your faith journey goes unseen by God. Not one prayer, not one tear, not one moment where you chose faith when fear was whispering louder. God sees the moments when you keep believing even though life hasn't become easier. He sees the strength it takes to hold on to hope when circumstances are trying to pull it away. He sees the times when you remain kind in situations where anger would have been understandable. Those moments may not appear important to the world, but they are deeply significant to God. In a culture that constantly celebrates what is visible, success, popularity, public achievements, it's easy to forget that many of the most powerful acts of faith happen quietly. They happen when no one is applauding. When there are no cameras, no recognition, no reward waiting on the other side. Just a believer choosing to trust God anyway. And that kind of faith is incredibly powerful. Because faith that survives in hidden places becomes strong. It becomes steady. It becomes the kind of faith that cannot easily be shaken by circumstances or opinions. The truth is, some of the moments that feel the most invisible right now may actually be the ones shaping your character the most. They are the moments where God is building something inside you. Something deeper than success, deeper than recognition, deeper than temporary results. He is building a heart that trusts Him fully. One day, many believers realized that the seasons where they felt unseen were actually the seasons where God was working the most quietly and the most intentionally. Not the prayers, not the struggles, not the tears. Everything mattered. And if you're listening to this right now and wondering whether your quiet faithfulness is worth it, remember this simple truth. The God who sees everything has never once overlooked your story. And that leads to a powerful question every believer must eventually face. What if the chapter you're living through right now is not the ending you fear, but the beginning of something far greater than you ever imagined? What if the chapter you're living through right now is not the ending you fear, but the beginning of something far greater than you ever imagined? Sometimes life places us in moments that feel confusing, heavy, and uncertain. You look around and nothing seems to be moving the way you hoped it would. The plans you once felt confident about may have fallen apart. The answers you prayed for may still feel distant. And slowly, a quiet fear can begin to grow in your heart. The fear that maybe this is how the story ends. Many people reach a place in their journey where they start believing that what they see right now is all there will ever be. But that belief is often built on a dangerous misunderstanding. Because the middle of a story can feel exactly like the end when you cannot see the next page. Think about how many powerful stories in life begin with struggle. The person who feels lost before discovering their purpose. The season of waiting before a breakthrough arrives. The period of uncertainty before clarity finally appears. When you are standing in the middle of those moments, it's easy to assume nothing is changing. But just because progress isn't visible does not mean the story has stopped moving. In fact, many of the most important transformations happen quietly, behind the scenes, long before anyone sees the results. God often works in ways that unfold gradually, all at once, not always in ways that feel dramatic or immediate. Instead, He shapes the journey piece by piece, moment by moment, sometimes in ways that only make sense when you look back later. What feels like a delay can become preparation. What feels like confusion can become direction. Feels like an ending can actually become the doorway to something new. Many believers who once felt stuck eventually discover that the season they wanted to escape was the very season that changed them the most. It strengthened their faith. It reshaped their priorities. It taught them lessons they would have never learned in comfortable circumstances. And when the next chapter finally arrived, they realized something surprising. They were no longer the same person who started the journey. They were stronger, wiser, more prepared for the purpose that was waiting ahead. This is why giving up too early can be one of the greatest mistakes a person makes. When the story becomes difficult, the temptation to walk away grows stronger. Doubt whispers that nothing will change. Fear tells you the best days are already behind you. But faith reminds us of something powerful. Your story is not finished yet. The struggles you face today do not have the authority to write the final chapter of your life. The confusion you feel right now does not determine your future. And the pain of this moment does not erase the possibility of joy that may still be ahead. Because as long as God is still writing your story, there is always another page waiting to unfold. And sometimes the greatest breakthroughs appear at the exact moment when people were closest to believing nothing would ever change. So if your heart feels tired, if the road ahead feels uncertain, if the chapter you're in right now feels difficult to understand, remember this: the author of your story has not finished writing, and the next chapter may be closer than you think. Here's the question that could change everything for someone hearing this today. What if the reminder you needed from God was not coming tomorrow, not next week, right now in this very moment?